Hey, and thanks for joining us for another episode of the Music History Project. Today, we're going to be airing part one of a two-part series on Henry Steinway of Steinway Pianos. Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
All of our content comes from the Oral History Program, which is sponsored by NAM, the National Association of Music Merchants. And that is a program that is over 3,000 interviews and constantly growing. If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.nam.org/library. All right, thanks for joining us again. We're going to be talking Steinway pianos today, specifically a oral history interview that Dan has captured with Henry Steinway.
I'm so excited about this because Henry was a true legend and a dear friend to many people in the music industry. And here in the NAM building, he was the first president of the Museum of Making Music Board here in Carlsbad, California. And so many of us got to know him over a long period of time. So it's really neat to have an opportunity to share with you some of his insights, history of his company, his family members who contributed to the growth and development of the piano, and his own role in the company, as well as some of his insight on the industry and how it changed over his long career. So I'm really excited about sharing this interview. And I believe this is the first interview that I conducted back in November of 2001. Is that right, Mike?
Yep, that looks to be right. So it's an oldie, but a goodie.
Our favorite word. And this interview is one of many full-length interviews that are featured on our website. Henry contributed quite a significant amount of his time to help promote the oral history program by providing content and everything. So if you want to jump online and check out this interview in its entirety or any of his other full-length interviews or web clips, you can do so on our website. Which, Dan, we'd like to hear you today.
So you can get all of these great, I feel like I'm the commercial for Tommy Boy all of a sudden. You can get all these great brake pads at Callahan Auto. That's www.nam.org/library.
Almost, Dan. You're almost
I wanted them to search for it.
All right, so let's jump right in. The first section of the interview we're going to be hearing today is Henry Steinway talking kind of just general specifics about the Steinway Company, the start, its general history, everything like that, as well as some of the technical aspects that his family incorporated into improving the existing piano and how that made them unique.
A family that had a business in a small town called Zezen in the Harz Mountains of Germany. And in 1850, they decided to move out, close up, and come to the United States. They'd making pianos in Germany, and it was then becoming difficult to do business, and it was after the 48 Revolution. And it was a father and mother and 5 sons and 3 daughters who were involved. And they came to New York in 1850. And as soon as they landed, they got jobs with all different piano makers so they could learn the business, learn the state of the art here and so forth. And finally, on March 5th, 1853, they formed a partnership of the Papa and the 2 older sons, Steinway and Sons, equal partnership, not Papa owning most, but the 3 of them together. And then the other sons were admitted as time went on, and they were able, through their study and through their experience, to make a better piano. They made certain improvements with the overstrung scale and a lot of technical stuff that's not worth going into, but they wound up with a piano that actually did sound better. And this piano was accepted by musical circles in New York. And that's how Steinway started its promotion of artists, figuring, well, that's fine. They can advise us on the piano. We'll use them as publicity. And then in 1867, they showed in Paris the great exhibition there. And really, the piano was better than all the old European ones, and that was Steinway's big success. They won the gold medal there, and the reputation grew. And as an outgrowth of that, Steinway decided it had to do something about the world market, just not New York alone. And so they first started in London with a branch store. London was then the center of the world. In 1875, that was the center. And then ultimately in Hamburg, Germany in 1880, a manufacturing facility, which somewhat luckily has survived all the wars and still is a part of Steinway & Sons. And they picked Hamburg because it was a seaport and they could ship from there to all over the world, including the London subsidiary. So that's sort of a brief way of how it grew. Then on the corporate side, it turned into a corporation. And have to mention that when they went to pick their symbol, they picked LVB. Ludwig von Beethoven is the stock symbol when you look it up. So that's a brief history. There's a lot more of the various things, but that gives you the general story.
Tell me a little bit about the technicalities that your family members had incorporated into the piano, maybe even as early as at the beginning, to really distinguish that Steinway name.
Well, that I can certainly do that. The very first thing was to take two ideas which had been floating around. The idea of an overstrung scale, meaning the bass strings cross over the treble strings. That had been floating around. And the idea of using a cast iron plate, which had also been around. Steinway adopted these two and added a couple of wrinkles, one of which was a downward projecting flange on the bottom of the plate that made it touch the rest plank in a better way and could get more tension on the piano. And the way the strings were displayed was not straight, but in a fan shape. So by about 1890 or so, the piano, as it's known today, is pretty well set in its design. And we think Steinway, building on the accomplishments of others, like any invention, set the tone and was imitated widely. And if you look into any piano today, they look the same. They have the overstrung scale, they have the plate with the certain wrinkles on it that Theodore had invented and so forth. So back in our history, it was one of those family things. One of the strengths of it was that there was so much family, not just father and son, but ultimately this Theodore Steinway and his younger brother William, who was 15 when he arrived here, speaking English, and he was the business administrative promotional head, was way ahead of his time. And they made a powerful combination. Then the nephews came up in the business, and there were the 3, 4, 5 nephews that stuck with it, and right into my time. And so there was always some family talent around that seemed to take to the business. So that's it.
Do you recall if, was it Theodore in charge of Steinway during the beginning period of the museum around the 1880s, 1890s? Is that about right?
At that time, William Steinway, the last surviving son, was in charge. And he was very active in the Piano Makers Association, which he'd been with for many, many years. The Piano Association goes back to I forget what, but I think the NAM was created in 1901, was it? Grew out of that, and they had conventions and all that sort of stuff. So it was William until 1896. And then when he died, his nephew, Charles, his brother Charles, who died young's son, took over. And then he died in 1919, and his brother, Frederick T. Steinway, was president. And under his leadership in the 20s, this building that we are sitting in, Steinway Hall, was built as a special retail showroom. And then in 1927, he died, and my father, Theodore E. Steinway, took over. And then when he got sick in 1955, I became president, and that was the first really time when it had gone from a father to a son. And I had started in the business with several cousins who weren't named Steinway. They were the Zieglers were interested in the Casabias, and a fellow named Frederick Vitor, who was my particular boss. So that's how it went.
So there, right off the bat, we already are starting with this great concept that before the Steinway family were involved with creating pianos, many of the main elements that we now know of as a modern piano did not exist. So their role in developing some of the fanning of the strings, for example, and some of the other techniques that they came up with and the many patents that they filed over the years really helped create what we now refer to as the modern piano, which is really neat. So again, a great reason why we documented this story with Henry Steinway, and why it's so exciting to hear in his own words that great story.
So next up, we're going to hear Henry talking about his relation to the original Steinway, his father, as well as manufacturing during the war years, and then going on to talking about his brother opening up the Steinway store in Berlin.
So your relationship to the founding father of Steinway is?
I am a great-grandson of the original fellow. The reason for that is my grandfather, William Steinway, had 2 marriages separated by 20 years, and I am descended from the second wife. So when William Steinway died in 1896, my father was only 13 years old, so I never knew him, and even he never knew him. He always told me he was scared to death of his own father because he was this irascible old man, but that's the way it goes, and so they were in the business.
Tell me about your father.
Theodore Steinway was a very interesting fellow, I think, because he had been trained to go into the technical end of the business with his cousin, Henry Ziegler, who was a descendant of Doretta Steinway. And that's why I'm named Henry Ziegler Steinway after his one. And he liked that. And he wasn't, his older brother William was the outgoing one and should have been the designated successor. But through various circumstances, my father was projected into running Steinway. At the peak time, 1927, was a great turning point for the industry, which nobody knew. Network radio came in 1927. The player piano was killed absolutely dead. I mean, it just fell down in 1927 because people, no more rolling back the rug and dancing. It was all, let's listen to the radio and Amos and Andy and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, 1929 struck with all the difficulties that came on. The factory was closed for a couple of years, and so my father had a hell of a time. And then, just as things were getting better and the little attractively styled upright was bringing the industry back in the late 30s, came the war, and we were forbidden to make pianos for 3 or 4 years there. And for my father, a particular woe, because all 4 of us were eventually in the service, and that bothered him a great deal. And then he got sick, and in 1955 he gave up the presidency, and he died in 57. So he had a particularly rough ride, I would say, and was a man who would like to have collected books. He loved amateur acting. He was an intellectual type of fellow, and he told me he had planned in the early days that he would retire when he was about 50, and he would do some collecting. Among other things, he was a stamp collector, and he almost invented what's known as the topical collection. He had a collection of music and stamps that was absolutely fabulous, and was all sold after he died. So that was Theodore Steinway. Then his brother William had gone to Europe in 1909 to open up Steinway's store in Berlin, which still exists after many wartime experiences. And he liked it and stayed there, so that's how that happened. He was the European general manager until 1939. When the war started, he came back here and was with Steinway until he died.
It was nice to get a little picture of the family history, the family tree there from Henry. And what's really cool is a component of this interview that we actually won't be featuring on the podcast because it just doesn't do it justice over audio is at the conclusion of this full interview that's hosted on our website, you can see Henry showcase a family tree of sorts of the Steinway family that he had in his office. But obviously without the visual, it doesn't really play well.
Yeah, it's a lot of it's a lot of him holding up artifacts and really cool stuff to look at, but yeah, without the video, it doesn't really make any sense.
But it is a great memory that I'll always cherish, is going to his office at the Steinway Hall there in New York City, where the pianos were being tuned in the basement, and where there was a showroom, beautiful ballroom-like showroom in the middle, and then Henry's office with his cute little typewriter, manual typewriter that he still used to put all of his correspondence in. And in that office is where he showcased all those awards and plaques and pictures, and it was really neat. I'm glad we did document that. But when you were talking about the family tree, I just wanted to make mention for those folks who are kind of wondering his own era. Henry was born in August of 1915 and passed away in September of 2008. So that was the era that he lived. His brother John passed away a few years before him, and together they were really a dynamo in the industry. They went to a lot of conventions and educational programs together, as well as touring around all of their many dealers, the retailers that sold their pianos throughout the country and the world. And in fact, speaking of his office, when I was there for another visit several years after this interview, Henry kindly pointed to 4 filing cabinet drawers and said, I would like to donate all of these when I pass away to the NAMM Resource Center. These are all my correspondence with all of the dealers over the years. And I was, of course, thrilled. And upon receiving them, I just remember sitting on the floor here in the office at NAMM and looking at some of these folders, one after another, of his correspondence with these dealers and these personal relationships that he had created, and the fact that he was invited to weddings of the kids of the store owners, and how that was just a really compelling relationship, just one after another. People really took a liking, as you can hear in his voice, very gentlemanlike, very passionate, just down to earth as well. Although he did wear a bow tie just about every time I saw him. So upon one of his visits here at the NAMM building, I said, for our archives, we really should have one of your bow ties, and he gave me one. So somewhere in our archives, we have a Henry Steinway bow tie. But another just quick thing about the family is his wife, Polly, was such a supportive person, and I really do wish that we had convinced her to do an interview, but she was very shy and behind the scenes. But just a quick word about her. She was definitely there behind the scenes, but very important on all of those business decisions. I think Henry traveled to Washington often, and she was always with him. She helped with many of the big celebrations that they had over the years, the 100th anniversary, 150th, and so on. And Polly was very much a part of all of that. So just to make sure we acknowledge her and her role in keeping Henry straight and narrow. And so let's continue with this interview that goes back to 2001. What is our next subject?
We're going to be talking about the manufacturing plants that were built during his father's time, Henry's father's time, and the development of Steinway Place. And before we kind of rolled into that, I wanted to ask Dan if he had been out to Steinway Place before.
Yeah, that is the manufacturing component of their operation in New York. It's actually on Long Island, in Long Island City, which is sort of the very west part of Long Island, close to Manhattan, and very historical place. I mean, when I went there, I actually just took a deep breath and said, okay, so this is where it all happens. It really is neat. And the workers there are all very dedicated people. I was really impressed with the longevity of so many of them. I interviewed, I think, a half a dozen that day, just the people who were there over 30 years. It was just amazing. And so a very special place and very old school. You know, they have some modern technology in there, of course, but they also have some motors run by belts still that take up the whole length of a long building, and really, really neat to see and feel that history for sure.
The manufacturing plants started off downtown New York in many different buildings as they grew, and then in 1860 they opened a brand new big factory at what is now Park Avenue between 52nd and 53rd Street. And it was, at its time, a tremendous factory. It was almost a block front there. That was an industrial district. The railroad then ran on top down to the old Grand Central that was further downtown. So it was an industrial district, and that was the main factory until about 1904. Then in the 70s, they got interested in Astoria. And William was the guy who was always on the lookout for growth and opportunity and changes. And they bought 400 acres out in Astoria, which is now Long Island City, near LaGuardia Airport. It's in that little area there. And they made a backward integration into making their own plates and sawmill and stuff like that. That's how it started. And our present Steinway factory is located on that plot of land that they originally, it's now 12 acres of land in Astoria. It's still called the Astoria section, but it's not really on the map. It's Long Island City. And one of the streets was named Steinway Street. We have a big Steinway Street going through there. So you go down and see what I lovingly refer to as our subsidiaries, the Steinway Bake Shop and the Steinway Fruit Shop and all of those things along Steinway Avenue. They even have a big sale days in the fall, Steinway Days and all that sort of thing. And it's a nice little community of Queens still. So that's about the story on the manufacturing. And since then, we have developed that property in Astoria that was after the war when we consolidated. We had two factories and we consolidated on one, and the street was renamed Steinway Place, so that's its address. And it's about a 12-acre plot, and I forget how many feet, something like 300,000-400,000 feet of manufacturing there, which they have recently improved a great deal. They put in new windows and updated it, and new machinery, so it's a going concern.
Well, one of the main sort of staples of the Steinway Piano Company's marketing really is product placement. I mean, they were doing this long before the movies, where we, of course, associate that now. But they were very good about getting pianos in the White House when they had special guests like Vladimir Horowitz, or at Carnegie Hall for the opening of a special recital that had debuted there. They were very, very smart and clever about their placement, but also very selective in doing that too. They didn't do it just any place, and as a result of that, that gave some opportunities for their competitors. Namely a gentleman who was an apprentice to William Steinway, who went on to start his own company called Baldwin. So the rival actually went on for many, many decades, and Steinway always felt it was kind of humorous that it all started because the man got his training originally from Henry's grandfather. But interestingly enough, they took the corner market on school programs. Baldwin had the school market here in the United States for many, many years, for which Steinway had always lamented about. But they took their time, and I think very seriously so, again with product placement and putting Steinway pianos, particularly concert grands, in universities and larger amphitheaters and theaters, for which they would get, sort of, quote, more bang for their buck, while at the same time showcasing the amazing talents of classical musicians and noted pianists from around the world. So it was a really very clever but well-executed marketing plan.
So let's hear Henry talking about marketing and William Steinway.
Steinway marketing, I think William Steinway was an instinctive, what we now call marketer. He understood public relations, the value of his own participation in things, getting his name in the newspapers. He was a big Democrat. He was on the Democratic committees. He functioned on the Rapid Transit Committee that planned all the subways in New York and all kinds of public activities like that. And at the same time, he hired as a sales manager at the Philadelphia Sesquicentennial in 1876. A young Yankee used to come over and play the piano at night, and his name was Nahum Stetson. He came from Bridgewater, Mass. And William hired him as sales manager, and he stayed as sales manager for 50 or more years, and he developed Steinway's distribution pretty much as it is today. In other words, they appointed dealers to whom we sold the piano, and they were obliged to promote it, and such people as Steinert in Boston and Sherman Clay in the West Coast, and many of those go back to Nahum Stetson's time. And he also was a good hirer, and many of our executives, some of them lasting into my time, came and developed. And at the same time, William had hired another man named Tretbar, who was his personal assistant. And then as the nephews grew up, he devoted himself to the artist affairs and the running of and he was the guy who really created Steinway's artist connection, which is a rather subtle one because we don't pay them, but on the other hand, very few people can provide the service we have where there is a Steinway piano, wherever there's an audience at a dealer who has to ship this piano out when somebody wants to play it. And so the Steinway concert service grew out of Tretbar and Stetson, who was the sales manager, and really developed that kind of dealer. Of course, it started with big stores like Line & Healy Chicago, had, 10, 15 stores. Grinnell in Detroit had the whole state. And now it tends to be more restricted areas, although there's still certain big ones like Schmidt Music in Minneapolis, which has a big empire in the Middle West, and Bill McCormick down in Jordan Kitts has been very successful in expanding south. But we have a great many small dealers in towns who we depend on.
You can just really tell from that clip that Henry knows that the heart of a good company really is its employees, which I think is often a key to success for a lot of manufacturers and retailers and everything like that. So that's a nice little treat to see him acknowledge some of those key positions and some of the people that were hired to really elevate the company. And I don't think you can talk Steinway pianos without incorporating performance. I mean, it's an iconic piano manufacturer. I think when most people envision large grand pianos, they think Steinways are what they're seeing in their head.
Yeah, or just large concert halls in general. Mm-hmm. There's always, like whenever you see a picture of an empty concert hall, like right before a show, there's always a grand piano sitting on stage. And
that's right.
9 times out of 10, it's a Steinway.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to get to hear Henry talking a little bit about that aspect of the industry, the performance element, and the importance of having Steinways played in public, and then the development in the enclosure of the Steinway Concert Hall, which is pretty fascinating to hear him talk about that, and as well as a couple key players that I don't even want to attempt to say their name because I will butcher it. So this sounds like a perfect segue for Dan.
Are we talking about Rudolph Irken?
Not yet, but this one here, I'll point it out because I'm not even going to try and say it.
Well, actually, let's let Henry talk. I'm not sure I could pronounce it that well either.
Oh, okay. So we'll just let Henry tell the story.
Please.
From the early days, they realized the importance of having people play the Steinway piano in public, and they used that. And then, of course, they built this large concert hall on 14th Street, called Steinway Hall, which was the premier location for musical events from the Civil War, 1866, till we closed it about 1890 when they needed the space and Carnegie was being planned, Carnegie Hall and things like that, and another hall which is gone on 59th Street. So we got out of the concert business as such, and But in that time, Steinway had brought over from Europe a series of artists, and the two big successful ones were Anton Rubinstein, the original, not Artur, but Anton, who played 200 concerts all over the U.S. And then they brought many others over, but the big success was Ignaz Jan Paderewski, the great Paderewski, who came in 1891 and 2, I think it was, for the season, and just was an absolute sensation. I mean, he in many ways created the solo recital, one man, one piano, and his glowing reddish Polish hair, and he was an exciting thing. And of course, he came back and back and back till he was a very old man, and actually died in a hotel next to Steinway Hall. He'd come in 1940 with some reluctance to the United States when the war started, and died here, and was a remarkable fellow.
There are so many artists who have become synonymous with Steinway, but he probably is on the top of the list, wouldn't you think?
Yes, he is, as I say, sort of like what Babe Ruth is to baseball, a name everybody knows. Paderewski is a name that most people recognize. Of course, his last recital was in the late 30s, and there have since then have been these, in our field, big names. Horowitz, who burst on the scene in 1927-28, and was a new, different style of exciting piano playing. And then later on in the 30s came Rudolph Irken and Artur Rubinstein, who was able to communicate a tremendous excitement about performances, who enjoyed performing and enjoyed being entertained, and did a lot of good of that kind of promotion. He was always happy to be at a party afterwards and meet people, and that was so good for the music business and for dealers and so on. And there was a sort of a musical society which has now more or less disappeared in the world, but he was just great. And then, of course, there are a lot of awful good ones today, but I always remember the old ones.
Okay, now we get to talk about Rudolph Irken, right?
Yeah, but I could have said that one. I know. Just in case you guys are wondering out there, I do know how to read. So
Okay, good.
not very well, but I can do it.
Well, what's really funny, if you listen carefully to the line of questioning here from me in this interview in 2001, you can hear that I'm a little on the giddy side when I'm thinking, wow, Henry knew Rudolph Irken. When I was a kid, the first classical record that I heard was a Neighbors, and it was Irken playing Beethoven, and I was just mesmerized. I just could not get over how wonderful it was. So I studied a little bit about him, just read about him a little bit, and to sit toe-to-toe with Henry, who knew the man, was really kind of fun. Rudolph Irken was born in the Czech Republic in 1903 and really became a child prodigy, developed his skills on the works of Beethoven and became very well known for that. In fact, when he came to the United States in 1937, he debuted at Carnegie Hall playing Beethoven. It was often referred to as a monumental milestone for classical music. And just to kind of give you an idea of the impact that this guy had on classical music, it was as early as 1963 he was given the highest medal honor from the United States president to a non-citizen, and that was the Medal of Freedom in 1963. So the guy had a lot of impact, and it was really fun to hear Henry's views on the man. So let's get right to it. Here's Henry Steinway talking about Rudolph Irken.
Rudolph Irken was a remarkable fellow in that he truly was interested in teaching, and he soon discovered, he was married, had kids, and he went up to Guilford, Vermont, which is was then nowhere, and started this extraordinary Marlborough School in the summertime, when he said pianists should learn to play chamber music. And so this was a wonderful place, because many of today's artists went there, and never mind the solo stuff, they were assigned different things. They had concerts every weekend, and Irken would go around. You never knew what the program was, because he'd decide who was ready. And they'd say, okay, you're going to play Sunday, and you're going to play Trout Quintet, or whatever it was. And so he had this side that was truly remarkable. And of course his son one son, Peter, is a distinguished artist today, and the others are involved in music in one way or another. So he was a remarkable guy. Then he also became head of the Curtis Institute, one of the big teaching foundations, and he did a great job down there too. But he really liked it up in the country. He and Mrs. Irken liked to live there and have that old kind of German, cooking and the kids around, and he'd practice, and we had to send pianos up. He had a barn that he even made Columbia go up there and do the recordings. I think they would record up there and so forth. I remember one occasion when it was some anniversary of something, must have been the Philharmonic, and they gave him as a present a tractor, which is what he'd always wanted for the place up there. So on stage came this big John Deere tractor or something like that. I have some vague memory of this. Can't give the details. So he was a great fellow, much missed for this teaching thing, but fortunately his Marlborough thing is still going on.
I've been a big fan of his. That's why I was curious.
Yeah.
And in fact, on a family trip to Vermont, I made the family go up to see
Did you?
the college.
Oh,
It's
yes.
a beautiful place.
Oh, it's a beautiful spot, lovely, and he made it work. I mean, the people would come there from all over, and for about 6 weeks in the summer when these concerts are given, and it still goes on. I don't go there anymore. I live in Vermont, but I'm too lazy to go 2 hours drive to go to the concerts. But he was a remarkable fellow, and of course he played certain music like Max Reger that nobody played, and entirely different type from Rubinstein, who had this wonderful flash and panache and all that sort of thing. I remember being on a radio once with Rubinstein, and the young interviewer in the radio said, "Mr. Rubinstein, you don't play any contemporary music." And Rubinstein says, "I play my contemporaries." And I thought that was a perfect answer. And he did. He played all the Spanish guys and all that stuff.
So as you can imagine, we could sit all day and just talk to Henry about these wonderful musicians that he knew very well, one after another. But unfortunately, I only got to a few others, one of which is Vladimir Horowitz, who we're going to be hearing Henry talking about next. Mr. Horowitz was also born the same year that Rudolph Irken was, 1903, only not in the Czech Republic, but in Russia. And as many may know, Horowitz really defined classical music for his era, and playing the Steinway was his insistence wherever he went. And so as a result, he developed a great relationship with Mr. Steinway, and it's also wonderful to hear him talk about sort of the personal side of the genius that was Vladimir Horowitz. So let's get right into that, if you don't mind.
Well, Horowitz lived in a house up in the 90s in Manhattan here. And if you know New York houses, they're 20 feet wide. They go up 5 floors. And they all used to have a stairway going up to the first floor, and the servants went down the basement. And Horowitz had his own concert grand in there, and the only way you could really get it in was through the window. And so you had to take the frame of the window out and get it in. And when he started playing again and recording, he often wanted that piano. And so several times we had to take it out, bring it to the recording studio, and then bring it back. Then he'd experiment with other pianos and would finally play. Steinway has now one of his pianos, which they send around to dealers, and it's used as display. People love to come and look at it and play on it and so forth. But there's a thing about concert artists. When they're young, they'll play anything. When they get older, they want the security of some piano that they know. Rubinstein used to say, "I'll play any piano. I can conquer anyone." But when he got older, he'd say, "Well, would you send this one to Boston for me, and would you send that one there?" And way back in the days of Rachmaninoff, he would come at the beginning of the year right here in Steinway Hall where we're sitting, and they would line up 8 or 10 concert grands, and he would pick 3, one for orchestra, one for solo, and one backup. And then those three would be leapfrogged around depending on what his tour was that particular year. And in those days, we still had railroads, and American Express worked, and we could ship these things all over the place. Now everything has to be done by truck, which is a lot more cumbersome and quite a lot more expensive. But that's the way. He had no particular one. He would start each season. Sometimes he'd pick the same one he had last season. Sometimes he wouldn't. And he was a wonderful pianist.
So that was Henry talking about the vast amount of musicians that have played Steinways over the years. And one reason why these artists play Steinways is because of the consistency of the instrument. Steinway prides themselves on their craftsmanship, and we're going to hear Henry talk about that now.
No matter how consistent we try and make them, they are put together by hand. And so there are inevitable differences in the touch and tone. And then each person, like Horowitz and Rubinstein, couldn't play the same piano. Their technique, it's a touch-tone thing. Hard to separate psychologically what it is. But Horowitz had great strength and could play the note from just above the escapement, and Rubinstein liked one with more resistance. And so our people would make these fine regulations too that would fit each one, and still do. That's what this ambient noise you're hearing out here is the man tuning some of these pianos that will be selected by somebody.
So a little earlier we were talking about product placement and how Henry and his brother John started a relationship with the White House. And so this next segment of Henry's interview, he'll be talking a little bit about that history and that collaboration, which still continues to this day.
Grover Cleveland came from Buffalo, New York, and William Steinway, my grandfather's first wife, came from Buffalo, New York, and he had known him as a young lawyer in Buffalo. And then when he became president, William Steinway was a big Democrat, and of course Cleveland was a Democrat, and he remembered him, and there was certain interchange. And then, as you know, Cleveland was married in the White House, and William gave him a piano for his wife. And I think that gave Mr. Nahum Stetson, the sales manager, the idea that we want the White House to have some form of official Steinway there. And what worked out was that finally, by the time, it took a little time, but by the Theodore Roosevelt administration, we had given to the White House an official piano for the East Room. And it's a beautiful sort of Victorian decorated piano with on the inside cover is a painting by Thomas Dewing, who was a very famous depictor, especially of women, and these are 9 graces dancing across there. It belongs to the Smithsonian. They have restored it, and they use it from time to time as displays. And last time I saw it was in the Smithsonian Museum of Art, one of those art museums, because they had a Dewing exhibition, and they had the piano there along with Dewing paintings. And then we like to, piano 40 years old, should have a new piano. So in Franklin Roosevelt time, my father had created a new White House Steinway, which is still there. And that's in a sort of, I guess, we called it modern, I guess it's called Art Deco style. A big mahogany, lightish color with tremendous eagles, and around the side it depicts certain music symbols. And for the last 20 years we've been trying to give the White House a new one, and they say no. This is an artifact like all the other furniture. There's now some kind of a foundation really controls the public rooms in the White House, and you can't fool with anything without them. And so the first time we did 15 years ago, it says, no, take it back and fix it up. So we had to take it back and redo the action and all that sort of thing. And it's still there. They're trying again now to see if we can give them a new one, but it doesn't seem to work. It's all a marketing thing, to see. A 40-year-old piano is perfectly good, but we like the idea that you have to replace things every once in a while.
I think that's a perfect place to end part 1 of the Henry Steinway podcast. What do you guys think?
Yep.
I think so.
Perfect. Hey, so thanks for joining us on this episode. We're going to have the conclusion of our interview with Henry Steinway in 2 weeks, so make sure you check back in with us. But in the meantime, if you've got something nice to say, please leave us a review and rate us on iTunes. We would greatly appreciate it. And as always, if you have suggestions or comments for future episodes or some awesome feedback, hit us up at library@nam.org. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.